I'm Karishma Vaswani in Singapore. The headlines. The power of pop. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un attends a concert by South Korean music stars. Is it another sign of improving relations? Falling back to Earth, China's defunct space station is expected to re-enter the atmosphere in the next few hours.
I'm Kasia Madeira in London. Also in this programme, people return to the Philippine city of Marawi a year after much of it was destroyed in battles between the army and Islamic State allied fighters. And Japan could be preparing to execute the cult members responsible for the deadly 1995 nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Good morning. It's 8 a.m. in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London and 8:30 a.m. in Pyongyang, where North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has attended a groundbreaking pop concert featuring South Korean stars. The event is the latest in a series of conciliatory gestures that appear to mark a thaw in relations between the two sides. The leaders of the two Koreas are due to hold a summit on the border later this month. This report by James Waterhouse contains some flashing images.
The sight of Kim Jong-un waving to enthusiastic applause might not be anything new, but South Korean reports say he's now the first North Korean leader ever to go to a performance by an artistic group from the south. Nearly 200 singers, dancers and technicians are in the capital for two concerts. South Korean ministers say he showed much interest during the show and asked questions about the songs and lyrics. The 1,500 spectators in the audience were treated to performances which included Korean pop, also known as the hugely popular K-pop. Veterans Cho Yong-pil and Lee Sung-hee were singing, as well as the girl group Red Velvet, who made their intentions clear before leaving South Korea.
It is our great honour to perform with veteran singers. As we're the youngest singers, we'll do our best to deliver bright energy to North Korean people.
It's hoped that bright energy will serve as a peace gesture ahead of a meeting this month between the leaders of North and South Korea. The South's Taekwondo athletes also performed for an audience of 2,300 in Pyongyang, ahead of a joint display of the Korean martial art with their northern counterparts on Monday. Beyond the concert, South Korea and the US have begun their annual joint military exercises. The Pentagon says they'll be on a similar scale to previous years, with nearly 300,000 South Korean troops and 24,000 Americans taking part. But they will be a month shorter and won't involve any nuclear submarines. Historically, the drills have always angered Pyongyang, but it's keeping quiet this time round. The leader spent his first overseas trip meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping last week, and he doesn't seem to be stopping there. He'll meet the South Korean President Moon Jae-in later this month, and has also offered a face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump. No date yet, but it is expected before the end of May. James Waterhouse, BBC News.
Much more on that coming up later in the programme. But now, an out-of-control Chinese space station is hurtling towards Earth, and it's set to make impact in the next few hours. China lost control of the spacecraft after it was decommissioned in 2013. Luckily, most of this space station is expected to burn up in the atmosphere. And earlier I spoke to an expert on space debris, Ted Milhapt of the Aerospace Corporation, and I asked him why we should be concerned about this particular crash.
Well, it's unusual in that it's a manned object, and so because it featured in a major movie, we thought there would be interest. It is going to put down a fairly substantial amount of debris in terms of mass. It's not unusual in that respect. But it's big enough that we do want to pay attention. We'd like to be able to warn people if it were coming down on their heads. But it's not likely. At this point, we're looking at it coming down in the middle of the Pacific off the coast of Chile, and if we're wrong by a little bit, it's most of that orbit track takes it over water or desert or pretty uninhabited areas.
It's 9 tons. How much of it will actually go through the atmosphere, and how much will just disintegrate as it reaches through the atmosphere?
Well, it wasn't designed for re-entry, and so without having the specifics of how it's constructed, it's difficult to estimate. But typically, you will see somewhere between 10 and as much as 40%. So it could be as much as 3 tons that survives. In what form, without having the structural details, I don't really want to speculate. But what we often see with objects this size is, something on the order of 2 or 3 tons.
Now, you were talking about it, the unlikeliness of it reaching a populated area, so it's unlikely to hurt anyone, hopefully. But when it comes to looking at what then reaches the Earth, how important is it to get hold of that? Is it even possible to get hold of that once we finally know where it lands?
It's in terms of the objects that survive. I mean, some of them will be substantial size. Depending, there in other spacecraft reentries, some of them have contained, hazardous materials in the past. We don't think that's likely with this particular one. But generally, when debris falls, it's pretty benign stuff that survives. It's just that you don't know that in advance. This will land most probably in the ocean, and I don't think anyone's going to bother to look for it.
Oh, really? And so in terms of tracking it, of course, it's difficult to know exactly where it's going to land, but will they be able to follow it? How does it work with something like this?
Well, the U.S. Air Force maintains a set of what's known as a space surveillance network that consists of radars and telescopes that are scattered around the world. And we use observations from those. There's an organization known as the JSPOC that does this. And we're using some of their data, and we make our own independent predictions based on it. Most of the community does something very similar. They use what the best data they've got. They use their own models and they make their own predictions. And it really depends on the final orbits as to when you're going to get a good track.
That was Ted Melhapt. He's a space debris expert. Excellent title. Of course, we're continuing to monitor that, and once Tiangong does land, then we'll let you know. But now let's bring you up to date with some of the day's other news stories. Myanmar's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi has told her country that it must listen to the international community if it wants to be accepted as a responsible nation. In her address marking 2 years in government, Ms. Suu Kyi spoke of humanitarian problems in Rakhine State, but the Nobel Peace Prize winner again omitted any mention of the military campaign that has forced out 700,000 Rohingya Muslims.
Acknowledging that it is important to be able to stand responsibly among the world's community, and while also walking in line with the requirements of our country, we need to respect the vision and intention of the international community. Not only Rakhine, which the world is focusing on right now, but also in the whole country. We need to peacefully develop, physically and mentally. Let's try hard with the strength of unity.
Aung San Suu Kyi speaking there. Well, also making news today, Islamist militants have launched a gun and a bomb attack on an African Union base in Somalia. Al-Shabaab fighters detonated 2 car bombs outside the base in the town, which is just southwest of Mogadishu. It is unclear exactly how many people died, but both sides say that they had killed dozens. A Kuwaiti court has reportedly sentenced a married couple to death for killing a Filipina maid. Joanna Demafelis's body was found in an abandoned apartment more than a year after her death. A Lebanese man and his Syrian wife were convicted in absentia of the killing. At least 25 people have been killed in clashes between government forces and militants in Indian-administered Kashmir. At least 3 Indian soldiers are among the dead. More than 70 people are wounded. Officials there say that it is the worst loss of life in a single day in recent years. China is imposing import taxes on a range of U.S. goods in retaliation for President Trump's decision to impose tariff increases on steel and aluminium imports. More than 120 U.S. products, including scrap aluminium, pork, nuts and wine, will all face increases in duties ranging from 15% to 25%.
Now, after fleeing for their lives almost a year ago, thousands of residents of the besieged Philippine city of Marawi have returned home for the very first time. Parts of the southern city were destroyed in 5 months of fighting between government troops and jihadists loyal to the so-called Islamic State. President Duterte declared victory in October, but the threat of unexploded bombs remains. Riley Carson reports.
After fleeing for their lives nearly a year ago, residents of Marawi are now clogging the streets, trying to make their way back in. Some 7,000 people were told they could return on Sunday, back to homes that were abandoned amid fierce fighting with militants loyal to the so-called Islamic State. The destruction here looks like images out of Iraq and Syria. This is where those jihadis were trying to set up an IS base in Southeast Asia. A reminder of why Samsida Menkol was forced to flee is spray painted across the wall of what was her bridal shop.
I wept with pain, anger and frustration because both my house and boutique, which I worked hard to pay for in Saudi Arabia for 16 years, are now destroyed.
There are stories like these all over Marawi. Those who desperately wanted to come back have found there's not much left.
We have no more residence to live. That's masakit.
I tried and failed to come back, but now our home is gone. It's so painful. This is our house. I cannot explain.
We worked hard for this house. We racked up debts paying to build this house. We've been paying off the debts. We'd not even finished paying them.
President Rodrigo Duterte declared victory here in Marawi back in October after a destructive 5-month battle. But even now, residents who come back are doing so at great risk. Explosive disposal teams working in the area say they can only be 80% to 90% sure that the area is clear.
The reason is because the other bombs are buried into the ground. The others have been embedded in the buildings and the structures have already collapsed.
With great caution over the course of the next month, even more people will be going back, returning to Marawi in groups for up to 3 days each. But it's not a homecoming. Instead, it's a salvage mission, and there is much work to be done before the rebuilding starts. Riley Carlson, BBC News.
You're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme. After 23 years behind bars for a deadly nerve gas attack, could members of a Japanese cult now be executed? This is Newsday on the BBC. I'm Karishma Vaswani in Singapore.
And I'm Kasha Madeira in London. Our top stories this hour. More signs of a diplomatic thaw. North Korea's leader has attended a pop concert in Pyongyang featuring some of South Korea's brightest stars.
Thousands of residents have been allowed back into the Philippine city of Marawi nearly a year after it became a battleground for the army and jihadists. Now, let's take a quick look at some front pages from around the world. The New York Times takes its lead from the latest developments in Syria, where government forces continue to push out of rebel fighters, I should say, from enclaves near the capital, Damascus. The paper says a motley mix of fleeing civilians, defeated rebels, and hardline jihadists are being transported to the towns in the north of the country. Meanwhile, the Japan Times looks at the big economic talks between Japan and China set for later this month. According to diplomatic sources, the meetings will take place in Tokyo, and they're the first to happen in more than 7 years. And finally, the South China Morning Post's front page features a story on the battle against jewelry shop heists in Hong Kong. The paper says a popular jewellery chain has upgraded security at its stores after several smash-and-grab robberies across the city. Now, Kasia, what are the stories that are sparking discussions online over at your end?
Oh, Karishma, if, like me, you can't even begin to imagine climbing Mount Everest even once, then 22 ascents, well, it just seems absolutely impossible. Not for Nepali climber Kamirita Sherpa, who has officially set off in an attempt to do just that. 22 is the record. And Sunday morning, after his prayers, he began another journey to the top. A successful summit could cement his place as the world's most experienced Everest climber. He first climbed Mount Everest back in 1994 and completed his most recent ascent last May. Good luck to him.
Well, staying with other news, the world's busiest subway was brought to a standstill in March 1995 as a mysterious substance was released across Tokyo's underground system. It turned out to be the deadly nerve gas sarin. 13 people died in the attack and thousands more were affected. It was carried out by the Om Shrinkyo cult. 13 members were found guilty, and there's now speculation that the government is preparing to execute some of them. Rupert Wingfield Hayes reports from Tokyo.
It's a spring morning in 1995, and panic has struck the Tokyo metro. People are collapsing and struggling for breath. 5 trains have been hit by a mass attack using a deadly nerve agent called sarin. The sarin gas has been made by followers of this man, Shoko Asahara, the leader of a religious cult called Aum Shinrikyo. Shizue Takahashi's husband was on duty at this station when the gas was released. He rushed to help people, was overcome and collapsed on the platform.
My husband had no idea it was sarin gas, whether he was in mid of terrorist attack. By the time they realized, my husband was already down. He started to have conversion and seizures.
Mrs. Takahashi's husband was one of 13 who died. 6,000 others suffered varying degrees of poisoning. In 2004, Shoko Asahara and 12 of his followers were sentenced to death for planning and carrying out the attack. Now the final barrier to their executions has been removed.
This behind me is the Tokyo Detention House, and this is where Shoko Asahara and the other senior Aum leaders have been held for the last 13 years. But in the last few weeks, 7 of the senior Aum leaders have been moved from here to other high-security prisons in other parts of Japan, suggesting the Japanese government is now preparing for their executions, and that those executions could all be carried out on the same day.
And it's like, what, is it a very packed, lots of people on the train?
Yes, suddenly...
The sarin attack left Masako Ogami with permanent nerve damage and partial loss of vision. 23 years later, the trauma of that day comes rushing back at the mention of Asahara's name.
But Asahara, I hope he never to live.
Shoko Asahara still has followers. The religious cult he founded still exists, albeit under a new name. Some fear his execution could turn Asahara into a saint. But after 23 years, it appears it will now happen. Rupert Wingfield Hayes, BBC News in Tokyo.
Let's return to the apparent thaw in relations between North and South Korea. Is it genuine, or is Pyongyang playing a game? I put that question to Evans Revere, the former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the U.S. government.
Well, there's obviously a thawing going on, but behind the thawing are some interesting tactical moves, and each side obviously has its own strategy to try to achieve certain goals that it has. And for the North Koreans, one of the key targets is the legitimization of North Korea in the international community. And behind that is a desire to gain acceptance of North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state. And towards that end, I think the North Koreans are willing to invest a bit in their relationship with the South, as well as their relationship with the United States. And I think that's what we see playing out here.
But if the rest of the international community wants to see denuclearization in the North, can this kind of dialogue even take place, given that the North seems insistent on having those nuclear weapons?
Well, the North is insisting on having those nuclear weapons, and as we will probably soon discover, both in the North-South summit and if the U.S. summit with North Korea takes place, the North Korean position going into those talks will be a firm determination to keep its nuclear status, even if it's willing to freeze parts of its production program or parts of its testing program. And there's the rub. These talks are going to be extremely difficult, extremely complicated. And part of the North Korean game plan is to try to put in place a very long and perhaps tortured negotiation that will allow it to buy time. That is the approach that the North took in the 90s and the 2000s. And I believe that's the approach that the North Koreans will be taking if and when they meet with President Trump.
Now, childhood obesity is a serious and growing health risk around the world, and nowhere more so than here in Asia, which is home to nearly half the world's obese children. The World Health Organization has labeled it an alarming trend that requires high-level action. But in Amsterdam, they've had some success in tackling the problem. Jeremy Cook reports.
Meet Tyrell, a typical 9-year-old but struggling with weight, caught up in the global childhood obesity crisis. With 1 in 5 of its children overweight, Amsterdam is determined to help kids like Tyrell.
You want to feel fit and your condition has to be okay, so I try to make him aware already, like just think about your health.
The Amsterdam initiative means every child is put through their paces, weighed, but also tested for strength, endurance and balance to see who needs help. For Tyrell, that means regular home visits from dietitians advising on healthy eating. And then there's the gym. Free sessions twice a week with other children on the program. They're having fun, getting fit, and crucially, losing pounds. The Amsterdam mission is to educate kids and their parents to the benefits of exercise, the dangers of unhealthy food. And it's targeted help. Is it a healthy option?
It's a little bit healthy.
A little bit?
Little bit healthy, yeah.
It looks delicious.
Yeah.
There's a special push to reach families in the low-income parts of town with large immigrant populations. In some Middle Eastern communities, almost 30% of kids are overweight, much higher than the national average. So they're coming together to share ways to improve their children's diets.
In my shopping list, I have only healthy things. When I come home, they say, Mama, it's only green. Everything is green.
The children of Amsterdam are on the move, on the ice, burning calories. It's free entry here and in other city sports facilities. Exercise helping to force obesity rates down.
There's nothing more important than the future of our children, not only all political parties, but also sports organizations, schools, shop owners. Everyone is helping, and that creates an environment in which we can change.
All schools in this program ban junk food, and break time means eating only fruit, drinking only water. Most parents are enthusiastic supporters, but of course, there have been challenges.
There's been some protest. Yeah, some people think that we should not be sitting in their parenting chair and telling them how to raise their children.
Elements of what they're doing here in Amsterdam have been tried elsewhere, including, of course, in the UK, but with limited success. What seems to be different here is that there's this consistent consensus, a joined-up approach, meaning that these kids are getting the same message from City Hall through their classrooms and into the family kitchen. In Amsterdam, it's all about the children. Lessons here, perhaps, for other cities, hoping to build a better, leaner future. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Amsterdam.
You've been watching Newsday. I'm Karishma Vaswani in Singapore.
And I'm Kasia Madeira in London, and let's end the programme with a dancing robot. Oh yes, that robot is dancing Gangnam Style, but there is a serious point to Elias. He speaks 23 languages and he's teaching children to learn more different languages. Thanks for watching.